And at each of our CST gatherings here, our biannual conferences, we've also always engaged a scholar from Boston College. So we've had David Hollenbach, Ken Himes, Kristen Heyer, Steve Pope. However, I actually would say that we've saved our best social ethicist for this year, Lisa Sowle Cahill. Lisa is the J. Donald Monin S.J. professor at Boston College, where she has taught theology since '76. She is both the past president of the Catholic Theological Society of America, as well as the Society of Christian Ethics. Lisa received her BA from Santa Clara U, and of course her MA and PhDs from the University of Chicago Divinity School. She wants to cover all the country because she grew up in Virginia. And as many of you know, her areas of special interest are in method and theological ethics, especially in natural law tradition. She is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and also has held offices in the American Academy of Religion. She is the author, literally, I'd say, hundreds of scholarly essays and books and journals, and holds numerous honorary degrees. She is a woman of immense wisdom. She has served as a theological consultant from the U.S. bishops to the Catholic Health Association. She is someone who epitomizes of bringing practitioners and academics together. We can proud to say that she's been a leader of the Catholic Base Building Network right here, based out of the Kroc Institute at Notre Dame. And tonight, when we talked and invited her here, we talked about, looking at the option for the poor. And so she's presented tonight's talk as From Option for the Poor to Option by the Poor: Flint's Water and the Problem of Political Will. And so Lisa will present, and then we'll open it up for questions afterwards. So let us give a warm Notre Dame welcome to a true CST hero, Dr. Lisa Sowle Cahill.
Thank you so much, Bill. It is always an honor and a pleasure to be here at Notre Dame, and especially to do anything in partnership with the Center for Social Concerns. And I feel so reassured that I can go back and tell my friends at BC, David, Steve, Kristen, Ken, that I was not the tail end, I was the culmination. So thanks for that. Okay. Tonight I want to talk to you about a vexing problem that we have here in the world of CST, Catholic social teaching. And the problem is, how do we give the ringing rhetoric of Catholic social teaching real political traction? Catholic social teaching talks a very good game. For us Catholics, justice in historical human societies is a proximate and achievable reality, not only as an eschatological hope, though of course it is that too. For a century and a quarter, CST has advocated for the common good, the dignity of every person, the rule of law, mutual rights and duties, representative government, and political participation. Since the middle of the last century, it has broadened its scope to the universal and not only national common good, summoned all men of goodwill as its audience and not only Catholics, put growing emphasis on the preferential option for the poor and not only simple equality, held up solidarity as the consummate social virtue and not only justice, and reached out to other faith traditions alongside Christians as bearers of God's will. In his 2015 encyclical on ecology, Laudato Si, Pope Francis expanded our horizons even further, placing the earth itself within our circle of concern, proclaiming everything is connected, and announcing that all creatures are moving with us to a final destiny in God, where the risen Christ embraces and illumines all things. Yet although the popes have been condemning war and advocating nonviolence since at least the Vatican I era, we are in a time of escalating nuclear threats and spiraling global violence. Papal encyclicals have been talking about respect for women, sex, and marriage since at least the 19th century, but rape is a prevalent reality in every culture, including in our church. In many cultures, abuse of women is not even regarded as a problem. John Paul II first put ecology on the CST agenda in the 1990s, and Benedict XVI made it a special focus. Yet 4 years after Laudato Si, the US is backing out from the Paris Climate Accord. How can we come to terms with these paradoxes? In Laudato Si, Pope Francis explains the difficulty of practical political reform in terms of what he calls lack of political will. Lack of political will is a shorthand way of saying that even when a moral truth about social justice is clear and intellectually persuasive, people fail to take action because they really are not invested, usually because their own interests are tied up in the status quo. Lack of political will is a social expression of sin that allows injustice to have free rein under cover of hypocritical affirmations of truth, as long as lifestyles need not be changed to accommodate it. A pertinent example is UN-generated climate agreements that are signed by member states but never ratified or implemented at home because they are not politically popular. Pope Francis laments, "It is remarkable how weak international political responses have been. The failure of global summits on the environment makes it plain that our politics are subject to technology and finance. There are too many special interests." How true are those words? Beyond diagnosing the problem of its lack, though, Laudato Si proposes innovative ways to create political will, particularly by appealing to a holistic, emotional, spiritual, experiential, and rational appreciation of value, and by mobilizing grassroots support. To these we shall return. First, we must also recognize that Laudato Si itself and CST in general have some blind spots or lacunae that impede their own worthy goals. A big one historically is lack of a doctrine of sin that is deep enough and wide enough to generate realistic approaches to social conversion, including the coercion of social behavior that will be necessary when voluntary commitment to standards of justice fails. Two more specific problems are racism and sexism, both forms of social sin that often lie behind lack of political will. Neglect of women's voice and agency is a shortcoming of CST as a whole, and racism is a special problem for the application of CST by the US Church. Laudato Si, for example, characterizes the wounded earth in female terms, such as our beautiful mother who groans in travail, and a sister who now cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her. Yet the encyclical does not even recognize, much less prioritize, the heightened burdens of climate change on women, nor women's agency for change. In fact, characterizations of wounded earth as a suffering victim play off images of women as objects of male abuse dependent upon men's compassion. Frankly, an equally plausible way to anthropomorphize the effects of climate change on our species would be as the retributive rage of an abused woman. Another blind spot is racism, not so much in CST as a whole, which does assume intersectional vulnerabilities in its preferential option for the poor, but in the application of CST by the U.S. Church for American Society. The case study to which I will turn in the second half of this paper is the water crisis in Flint, Michigan. Flint gives me the opportunity to expose the lack of political will to accomplish the goals of CST and to highlight both the problem of environmental racism and the need for women's activism. I have chosen a case from my own country for this paper, since Cardinal Bo and Gustavo Gutierrez, who are with us for the next 2 days, can speak much more eloquently and with experience to challenges arising from the global South. I will use the Flint water crisis to show that anti-Black racism in the United States of America deeply infests our national economy and politics, and to argue that in this, as in most other shortages of basic resources, the agency of women is a powerful ingredient for change. Moreover, I will show that in the case of Flint, as in many other cases worldwide, the solidarity of the powerful is not readily forthcoming. Yet, it can be evoked by the voice and action of the poor themselves. A remaining challenge for U.S. Catholics is to mobilize commitment across a broad swath of society, grassroots to top decision makers, and to do so internationally. Catholic social teaching must confront the intransigent realities of sin and social sin better than it has done in the past. This is why Pope Francis says, quote, "In the absence of pressure from the public and from civic institutions, political authorities will always be reluctant to intervene because it clashes with a political mindset of short-term gains and results," close quote. Yet I refuse to concede, and I believe he does too, that transformative action for social change is a lost cause, despite the continual defeats of justice our world continues to witness. I do affirm, with Aquinas and Catholic social tradition, that it is possible to move historical conditions closer to justice and to make progress toward the common good a significant amount of the time. We have specific evidence in the work of liberation movements and of peace builders worldwide that the incarnation, resurrection of Christ, and the Holy Spirit are already renewing creation. That being said, human failure to take action on climate change is one of sin's more egregious effects. John Paul II, in Solicitudo Rei Socialis, identifies the structural embodiment of sinful grabs for power and greed as structural sin. Structures of sin, he says, are always linked to the concrete acts of individuals who introduce these structures, consolidate them, and make them difficult to remove. And thus they grow stronger, spread, and become the source of other sins, and so influence people's behavior. I want to add an important clarification. Structures of sin do not exist outside individuals, nor do they have a reified life or existence all of their own. Social structures of any kind are essentially patterns of human organization that are explicitly or tacitly agreed upon by participants. Structures are sustained by and only by continued cooperation. the collective agency humans achieve by means of participation in structures such as the University of Notre Dame, Catholic Relief Services, or the National Rifle Association, gives them greater power, greater social power than they would possess simply as individuals. Moreover, established and routine participation in structures, whether good or bad structures, disposes us to continued participation and creates inertia against change. Yet structures are not immovable objects, nor do they coerce us. They are within our power. Participants in structures, of course, are participating in numerous structures simultaneously: family, education, employment, politics, religious tradition, and so on. They are also participating in and formed by a culture or cultures that inform their worldview and values. Therefore, to influence structural participation, it is also necessary to influence something much broader, deeper, and more complicated, yet also more quotidian: culture and its internal subcultures. Culture includes beliefs, attitudes, common practices, and taken for granted goals. Racism, sexism, and homophobia, for example, are all cultures or cultural streams, as is a sense of oneness with the natural world, or an expectation that basic needs are hard to meet and require constant struggle. What I want especially to emphasize is the comprehensiveness of culture, its dailiness, the way it is embedded in us and we in it. Culture predates and generates our consciousness, our concept of self, our values, and our patterns of action. Culture is part of who we are, how we function, and all our relationships. It is both infinite and granular, concrete and very diffuse. Culture is hard to change because it has seeped deeply into the pores and perspectives of everyone. It is not an object out there that we can work on, but part of the same outlook and vocabulary with which we are trying to change it. I think we're going to see all these factors at play in the case from Flint. Building on the liberation theology of Gustavo Gutierrez, Daniel Castillo interprets Pope Francis's rather abstract concept of integral ecology as a call for the radical conversion of the political and cultural dimensions of the present global systems or structures. Yes, structures and political systems must be transformed, but prior to that, and more pervasively, there is a qualitative dimension of human life on which structural change is contingent. It involves values, worldviews, identities, and imaginations, all part of culture and not captured in concepts or reasoned explanations. As we saw so clearly in the 2016 US presidential election of Donald J. Trump and the British Brexit referendum, political behavior is not always, or maybe rarely, driven by rational analysis of policies and hard-nosed cost-benefit predictions. Instead, in 2016, cultural identity and feelings of cultural displacement and cultural anxiety focused, rationally or not, on immigrants and racial ethnic minorities. And these anxieties and senses of displacement drove voter behavior. Or, to take a contrary and perhaps more positive example, the January 2017 Women's March in Washington, D.C., built on existential emotions of fed-upness, resistance, and solidarity, symbolized by myriad pink knit pussy hats with ears. Political emotions inspired millions of women and male allies to do some bonding and new identity formation, around political goals that were still inchoate, not carefully crafted, and not shared uniformly across all participants. Emotions can begin to change worldviews, partly by enhancing our appreciation of realities we do not fully understand, but to which we are starting to relate. Daniel Castillo proposes that there is ultimately a theological level of liberation, in which the new identity we form denotes salvation, liberation from sin and communion with God, as related to love of neighbor. But a radical identity change will always be codependent with the coming to be of new communities and practices that teach us to see the world in a different way. In these too, grace is working. Ecological politics, for good or ill, is always bound into a broader complex of eco-social relationships that order the world. The same essential vision of identity formation and change informs Laudato Si. This encyclical is the first to be released with its own YouTube video. The video illustrates the beauties of the earth and its inhabitants, as well as the ugliness of drought and pollution and the hardships wrought by climate change. Pope Francis targets education as the primary modality of formation. This includes both spiritual and cultural dimensions. Education occurs in formal settings for the young, as well as in families, the media, activities of religious communities, and local regulation of recycling, littering, or polluting that raises consciousness and advances public norms. Education has an aesthetic dimension that moves people on an affective and imaginative level through art, images, music, creative literature, and participatory learning experiences. An important aspect of Laudato Si, then, is its appeal through poetry, prayer, and praise, including multiple references to St. Francis and 2 concluding prayers, one for all believers in a divine creator and one for Christians. Even if better ecological regulation is enacted, and indeed for laws to be enacted in the first place, he says, and this is a quote, "The majority of the members of society must be adequately motivated to accept them and personally transformed to respond." Pope Francis knows that all social change begins with changes in self-understanding, of connections to others and the universe, of our imagination of what is possible, and of little daily actions and real changes in lifestyle that turn vision and hope into reality. Before turning to my case study, let me just summarize my main points so far. First, Catholic social teaching has a theology and an ethics of solidarity and a preferential option for the poor. What we do not have is social action and structures that show we really believe the theology. Second, Catholics, like the societies in which we live, are still captive to structural sin, expressed as what Pope Francis terms lack of political will. That is a euphemism for hypocrisy. We are not prepared to act on the values we claim to cherish. Third, changing structures and behavior has to go beyond expression of gospel ideals or making a case for justice. All the stakeholders must be engaged at multiple levels of being and awareness, including emotions, spirituality, imaginative vision, and the daily actions that express what part of all that we take most seriously. Pope Francis knows this and recognizes that his vision of everything as connected will not be easily put into practice. As I next turn to the Flint water crisis, I am going to use a particular case of cultural and structural ecological racism, sexism, and classism to show that real change demands pressure from below, as well as conversion to compassion and solidarity. In other words, a real-life option for the poor is often contingent on an option by the poor who rightfully take action for justice. Now, the water crisis in Flint, Michigan. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis teaches that fresh drinking water is an issue of primary importance since it is indispensable for human life. Indeed, he continues, access to safe drinking water is a basic and universal human right. Yet, he adds, one particular serious problem is the quality of water available to the poor, exacerbated by the commodification of water and the privatization of access. These standards of Pope Francis are violated every day on every continent. Globally, over 1 billion people live in areas of physical water scarcity, and over another 1.5 billion lack access to water due to inadequate infrastructure to carry water from rivers and aquifers. In sub-Saharan Africa, women and girls spend hours a day carrying heavy water jugs for miles. You can see them on the Laudato Si YouTube video. But even here in the United States, one of the most prosperous countries on the planet, and one that consumes far more than its per capita share of the world's resources, the poor suffer from lack of access to clean, safe drinking water. The water crisis in Flint, Michigan occurred over almost 2 years, from early 2014 to late 2015, though with results that are still unfolding. The essential justice issue was the provision of a contaminated supply of water to a disenfranchised population, largely African American, by city and state bureaucrats who were largely white. Decision makers were biased against recognizing the needs and protests of the local population as having enough significance to warrant action against life-threatening pollution from which the deciders and their families were spared. Factors in the Flint crisis are replicated worldwide. When basic resources are in short supply, the wealthy will have first access, while the poor either go without or are exploited by corrupt leaders and institutions who overcharge them for inferior supplies. Environmental racism puts already marginal people in harm's way as toxic waste is dumped in their environment and natural resources are siphoned off to those who can pay more. Hope, however, comes from another side of the picture. Local activists can sometimes attract attention and exert pressure on the powerful by making alliances with people who are slightly more and even significantly more powerful than they. Such allies may be motivated by duty, professionalism, compassion, faith, or a sense of shared identity with those who wound up on the wrong side of power. Joint action can put corruption in the daylight and force demands to be met. The process also creates public awareness and can inspire solidarity and greater accountability on the part of those not immediately affected. Coercion and conversion come together for the good. This is what happened and is still happening in Flint. Flint, Michigan is a majority Black city where 40% of the people live in poverty as of 2016. In order to save money in the wake of a projected $25 million deficit in the city budget and a takeover by the state, the Flint water supply was switched from the Detroit Water and Sewage Department, which accessed the naturally pure water in Lake Huron, to the Flint River, which decades previously had been an industrial dumping site. The decision to use its water was taken by an emergency manager, accountable only to the governor, not to Flint's elected officials. In a city press release, the mayor of Flint asserted of the river water, "It's regular, good, pure drinking water, and it's right in our backyard." This is a step forward in controlling the future of our community's most precious resource. However, tests still revealed the presence of disease-carrying bacteria. The water eroded the iron water mains in Flint, turning the water brown. And most seriously, lead service lines to homes were now exposed to a corrosive substance. Lead began leaching into the water supply, exposing consumers, especially children, to heart, kidney, and nerve disease, as well as cognitive impairment, behavior disorders, hearing problems, and delayed puberty. Residents complained of the smell, taste, and appearance of the brown or orange tap water, but city and state officials denied and delayed for months. The General Motors plant in Flint terminated use of city water a few months after the turn to the Flint River, citing corruption of engine parts as a factor. The state of Michigan installed water coolers in its offices in Flint, even as state agencies made assurances of tap water safety. Universities and hospitals had their water tested. The Flint City Council voted to stop using the river water, a decision that the state overruled, citing the danger of rising water costs. Volunteer groups from Flint, like Flint Strong, began handing out bottled water by the case. Local churches, charities, and a United Auto Workers chapter delivered shrink-wrapped cases of water out of their offices, where residents lined up in snowing single-digit weather to receive them. Local activism gathered momentum, connecting individual families, generating grassroots protest organizations, and galvanizing local organizations, including the press and local NPR radio. Gradually, Flint activists drew in the EPA, established scientists and researchers, and the national press. Lawsuits were filed. Finally, in 2015, Governor Rick Snyder decided to reconnect Flint to the Detroit water supply, and a local nonprofit, the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, donated massive amounts of bottled water. I hate to think of all these plastic bottles, however, and $4 million to replace the damaged lead pipes. As sociologist Amy Krings points out, many of the more elite activists who went to the bat for Flint have been characterized as the heroes of the Flint water crisis. Yet their involvement would have been delayed and perhaps not even possible were it not for the sustained outcry of local residents turned activists and grassroots groups. Ultimately, the change back to Detroit water required a diverse community and residents who pushed and pushed and pushed and would not give up. Anna Clark, author of The Poison City, agrees. If Watts came to represent the 20th century urban crisis, she says, then Flint represents that of the 21st. Neglect, it turns out, is not a passive force in American cities, but an aggressive one. Yet Clark, too, finds heroism, most especially in the lion-hearted residents of Flint, who chose again and again to act rather than be acted upon, turning themselves into top-notch community organizers and citizen scientists, and building alliances with a diverse ensemble of professionals nationally to make themselves visible. I want to highlight the work of 3 women who were important catalysts in this process. One in the initial residents organizing, one faith-based organizer who is still uniting Catholic efforts with other denominations and civil society, and one who provided conclusive public demonstration that the water of Flint was poisoned. The first is the Flint resident mother and activist Leanne Walters, who with Melissa Mays co-founded What Are You Fighting For? The second is a Catholic peace activist and community organizer from Detroit, Kim Redigan. The third is pediatrician Mona Hanna-Attisha, who did a definitive scientific study that was the proximate cause of the governor's decision reversal. First, Flint resident Leanne Walters. In 2015, the Federal Environmental Protection Agency tested the water in the home of Ms. Walters at her request because she was concerned about the safety of her 4 children. The EPA regulation manager, Miguel del Toral, visited her home and found that the water had nearly 7 times the amount of lead permitted under EPA standards. Very alarmed, he notified federal and state authorities. He also leaked his report to Walters, who circulated it to the local press and the Michigan ACLU. At Del Toral's suggestion, Walters called Mark Edwards, an engineering professor at Virginia Tech, who had exposed similar lead contamination in Washington, D.C. Edwards and a Virginia Tech team went to Flint and collaborated with grassroots coalitions like What Are You Fighting For?, the Democracy Defense League, and Concerned Pastors for Social Action. They produced a report based on citywide water samples that confirmed residents' concerns. An ordinary and young, but very resourceful and determined Flint parent put this chain into action, Leanne Walters. My second water wonder woman is Kim Redigan, a Catholic theology teacher at University of Detroit Jesuit High School. Inspired by Daniel Berrigan, Kim Redigan has been a peace and justice advocate for decades. She has marched, protested, spoken truth to power, and been arrested multiple times in this country and around the world. When I first contacted her in February, she had just returned sick from a nonviolent peace action in Tijuana, Mexico. Redigan is on the boards of the Michigan Coalition for Human Rights, the Michigan State Council of Pax Christi, and the Detroit Area Peace and Justice Network, where she represents the Catholic worker movement. Redigan is also an active blogger and regular contributor to online social justice communities. A long-standing commitment is racial justice. She saw racism at play strongly in both Detroit and Flint. She gives one online reflection originally given at the First Unitarian Universalist Church in Detroit, the on-target title, The Violence of White Silence. As she says so rightly, those of us who are white have been swimming all our lives in an ocean of white supremacy that is so pervasive, so omnipresent, so deep that we don't even know we are wet, but that is no excuse. It is time to speak up with words and even better with deeds. Kim Redigan became involved in water justice around water shutoffs in Detroit, 70 miles from Flint. Detroit terminated service to consumers who could not pay their bills. They were, as in Flint, mostly African Americans living in poor neighborhoods. As Redigan sees it, it was about gentrification, water privatization, and closing the poor out. In July 2015, before the final revelations of evidence that brought official Flint denial to an end, she, with several civil society organizations, helped organize a 7-day march from Detroit to Flint, 70 miles, called the Water Justice Journey. Interviewed by the People's Tribune, she said, "The walk was the thread to weave together a series of important public events that highlighted people working on the front lines, community activists, public health workers, attorneys, pastors, and people committed to water justice, some of whom have been personally affected by unclean and unaffordable water." Next, the medical doctor, Mona Hanna-Attisha, the director of a pediatric residency program at a respected Flint hospital. As Dr. Hanna-Attisha grasped the growing danger to patients she called her Flint kids, she became obsessed with gathering enough evidence to sound the alarm. Born to an Iraqi immigrant family in England, then growing up near Detroit, Dr. Hanna-Attisha connected with the outsider status of her patients. She gratefully recalls the care of a childhood doctor, quote, with brown skin and dark hair like me, describes a favorite toddler as a beautiful brown girl, and owns her role as a doctor and a brown immigrant in a majority black city. Family connections in Iraq and ongoing violence there made it impossible for Hanna-Attisha to pretend that the suffering world is, these are her words, to pretend that the suffering world is a million miles away on another planet while we are safe and innocent. To her own family's saga, she attributes her passion and urgency in the face of the danger in Flint. Yet when Hanna-Attisha first presented the conclusive findings of a comprehensive and scientifically rigorous study showing that the children of Flint had elevated blood lead levels, nothing happened. A September 2015 press conference publicizing her evidence changed that picture. Governor Snyder then appointed a 5-man task force to review events in Flint. The task force concluded that community demographics, AKA race, had helped cause the disaster and kept it going far too long. A report from the Michigan Civil Rights Commission made that diagnosis official. There was plenty of blame to be shared by city and state officials and the governor himself. Governor Snyder ultimately went along with most of Hanna-Attisha's demands, admitting his and the state's willful negligence, sincerely and with integrity in her view. We see from the history of all these events in Flint the truth of Pope Francis's argument in Laudato Si. Momentum for structural change has to involve cultural transformation at multiple levels simultaneously, or there will not be the broad buy-in necessary to generate political will. This is why Laudato Si turns to education, spirituality, prayer, and aesthetic imagination as ingredients in popular mobilization. In Flint, these included grassroots organizations that called in the media to publicize water quality, set up internet sites to educate and agitate, used baby bottles filled with cloudy water as photogenic public symbols, and organized public protests and water handouts in the name of religion, faith, and the churches. If the powerful refuse to make the kind of concrete, effective, and sustainable option for the poor that comes from genuine solidarity, then there can and will be an option by the poor as agents in their own behalf. As Pope Francis does point out, whatever progress has occurred in favor of environmental justice can be credited to the action of civil society. Flint is proof positive. Things did not slow down in Flint after the 2015 victory, in which the governor admitted the truth of Flint's contaminated water. In fact, media focus heightened and interventions increased. The Michigan National Guard trucked in water. Catholic Charities began distributing water at its Flint Center for Hope, which serves 60,000 people a year. The University of Detroit Mercy, in partnership with Our Lady of Guadalupe Church in Flint, targeted Flint's Latinx population for water awareness and distribution. Joy Tabernacle Church, under the leadership of Pastor Sherman McCathern, had already been a fulcrum of community life. They set up a water distribution center with proactive outreach to community members. Truckloads of water were sent from around the country, by organizations from the Girl Scouts to the United Auto Workers. Union plumbers donated countless hours to replace Flint's lead-leaching pipes. As a result of the Flint water crisis, criminal charges, including manslaughter, were filed against over a dozen people. Over the next few months, the state legislature passed 3 budget supplements for Flint, totaling about $200 million in aid. Michigan State University and Hurley Hospital joined with Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha to create a public health program to follow the health of Flint children long term. With the support of Flint Congressman Dan Kildee, they established the Flint Child Health and Development Fund to underwrite these interventions and care. Now I ask, where were the Catholics in this process? My first investigations were disappointing. Some local Catholic activists even lamented to me that the church as such, beyond initial water handouts, had been largely MIA. Yet the picture is not all bleak, as my friends in theology at the University of Detroit Mercy helped me uncover. For example, as it turns out, Vicki Schultz, president and CEO of Catholic Charities of Shiawassee and Genesee counties, which is headquartered in Flint, had actually been raising questions about water safety at city meetings and brought these to the mayor during the early months of the crisis. Now, taking the longer view, she worries about infrastructure and funding for a sustainable response to water contamination, added on top of pre-existing poverty and racial inequality. We might also look at Faith in Flint, a Catholic community and coalition of ministries created in 2015 under Tom Firestone, the pastor of 4 of Flint's 6 Catholic churches. The mission of Faith in Flint begins to address the underlying structural deprivations and abetting racist culture that made the water crisis possible. Its ministries include a coffee house named after Dorothy Day and a women's center where community members can earn a GED, learn job skills, and seek help with childcare. The center is expanding to include a food pantry, job training for women and men, educational opportunities, a bakery, and community garden. It's a start. Turning to the national picture, the U.S. Catholic bishops published a 2018 pastoral letter on racism, motivated partly by the water injustice in Flint. The letter acknowledges that years of systemic racism produce inequitable resource allocation in communities that remain de facto segregated. As an example, they say, the Flint water crisis resulted from policy decisions that negatively affected city inhabitants, the majority of whom were African Americans. The effect that this letter will have on the national political profile of the U.S. Catholic Church, and, for example, the voting priorities it urges on its members, remains to be seen in 2020. Though the immediate crisis has been alleviated, the structural issues behind Flint's poisoned water obviously continue. For example, there is still a state policy to have state-appointed city managers take over in terms of breakdown, short-circuiting the democratic process and local representation. Racism, unemployment, and economic hardship cannot be erased overnight or even in months. The Catholic Church needs to be active, more active than it apparently has been to date in Flint, Michigan, in addressing structural causes of racism. Handing out bottled water is compassionate and necessary, even life-saving. But Catholic activists like Tim Redigan see a much bigger set of structural issues. Entities like the Diocese of Lansing, Catholic Charities, and the Faith in Flint community can, should, and I hope are playing a role in changing structures of sin and the cultures that enable them and in which we all participate. It is key not only to provide services to Flint residents, but to support and indeed magnify the voice they already have. Catholics must never rest with platitudes about justice, the poor, and solidarity. In addition to, or in alliance with, our option by, of, and for the poor, we also need much more broad-based mobilization and action on behalf of environmental justice by lay Catholics in this country, working in alliance with, but not dependent on, Episcopal leadership. Venues at universities like the Center for Social Concern or the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies are excellent examples. Working to align a broader Catholic public is the Catholic Climate Covenant, established in 2006 as a coalition of the National Bishops' Conference and entities like Catholic Relief Services and Catholic Charities, as well as congregations of religious men and women and other organizations. Next June, Creighton University and the Catholic Climate Covenant will co-sponsor a conference aiming to integrate Laudato Si much more deeply into the life of the U.S. Catholic Church. Let's hope and recognize that that includes addressing other issues such as racism. The purpose of that conference, after all, is to reach beyond academia and the parish, and I hope it will take aim both at the disparate effects of climate change and the types of political action around which Catholics can mobilize. Water injustice is a shocking reality in the United States that reveals our nation's deep-seated patterns of racism, economic and class division, and wasteful consumption by the privileged who seem well able to ignore the suffering of their neighbors. Yet Flint shows how activism and commitment can make a difference and bring about hope. The next essential step, of course, yet a topic for another paper, is to create solidarity across communities and borders. The International Sisters of Mercy Reflection and Action process is a model in this regard, but I won't get into that now. Here or abroad, and through the many structures that connect us, Catholics must move beyond platitudes. We need tough-minded resistance and broad-based organizing by the poor, of the poor, and yes, still for the poor, that all may be empowered to act on their own behalf. Thank you. Okay, so what time it is? Okay.
So we have microphones both upstairs and in the corners, open for questions.
Or it doesn't have to be questions because
or comments.
Yeah, I can't really answer all the questions I raised, frankly. But other people's experiences or examples of activism or barriers that you've seen or dimensions that I haven't mentioned. You know, can we all reflect on this basic problem of lack of political will as a deep challenge for realizing the goals of CST?
Hi, my name is Gargi. I'm an undergraduate student, and I'd like you to discuss more the role of privilege and allyship in social justice issues. As an undocumented immigrant, I do not have the power that you documented people do for fear of retaliation from the government and ICE. Simultaneously, my voice and concerns are often drowned out from documented folks who think they understand the needs of undocumented immigrants better than me and all other 11 million of us. Please discuss how the focus should be on uplifting those who are at the direct front line of these issues.
Thank you. I think that question, which was really a comment, I think that illustrates really well what I was trying to show with the Flint example. In the Flint example, the original activism came from the people living in Flint, and they did identify their own needs. I mean, in that particular case, it was a basic need of the health and survival of their children, which there probably wouldn't have been too much disagreement about, from different people that were stakeholders in the situation. But I do think that the recognition of the urgency of the problem came from the people themselves that were immediately affected, and it wasn't recognized by the more privileged, analogous to your documented Americans who were in the vicinity of the problem but didn't act. Obviously, what that example shows and what you're also saying is that people who experience problems firsthand might have the best understanding of their dynamics and therefore what a real solution would look like. And, the power to say that should be recognized by everyone who wants to be an ally. I think the more privileged or advantaged in a certain situation should be willing to be that, to be allies, to give their resources, to lend a hand, as the three women did. I mentioned three women. One was actually a person whose home was affected by the contaminated water. And the two others were allies, but I think very much took their lead from the communities they were trying to serve. They were trying to raise attention, really. I think, if we were to talk about immigration as a justice issue, which we should, and then look at access to water, the specific issue of documentation doesn't arise in such a prominent way. In Flint, there's also a Latinx community, and they were slower to be involved. I think they had, many of them, from what I've read, had the barrier of not being fluent in English. So allies could, I think, really have helped them more, identify what they needed, and eventually that was done. But activism in that case didn't necessarily call attention to documented or undocumented status, and certainly in the case of migration, it would have that risk. So maybe you could tell us, or others could tell us, what would be the most helpful thing to do. Like, what is a way, what kind of a forum, let's put it that way, would be the most friendly and supportive to undocumented people who desire a voice and are already playing a role? Or are you afraid that any visibility really brings the same danger?
I think that the forum should be first and foremost led by all undocumented people that started work throughout a span of time. There were a bunch of undocumented people that started before Trump came in to talk about how Obama and how the Democrats have had a long play about the border issue that we all talk about now. I think that they should be at the front lines and have one of those as the panelists because they understand the problem that it's been going on for at least 10 years. I think that it should not just be Latinx panelists because there's often a lot of anti-Asian and anti-Latinx in the Latinx, in this largely Latinx immigration issue. And I think that a lot of the migrants that are coming south from the border are also transgender, but we don't necessarily talk about it. So they not only have to worry about being in these detention centers, but worry about what their transgender identity is going to do. So having somebody, not as more of like, oh, this transgender person, like, take off the list, but like really trying to be as comprehensive as we can. Having a Black undocumented activist talk about what it's like to be undocumented and face police brutality, because they have 4 times the rate in this country. Talk about how Obama, like, largely created, was nicknamed reporter-in-chief. Talk about like the Asian part of it too and what it means to be Muslim and live in New York City and be undocumented and have Mayor Bloomberg signed into law stop and frisk, which literally gave the legal authority for the NYPD to stop anyone that looked suspicious, and what effect that had on those who were Muslim and those who were undocumented, having a wide range of undocumented journalists and grassroots organizers.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was great. That was a beautiful illustration of the point that you were making, that if we listen, we see greater complexity in the problem and more diversity within that problem that we can tend to look at in a very uniform way. So that was great. Thank you for bringing that.
Hello, I'm Alan Deck from Loyola Marymount University. Good to see you. Your remarks this evening made me think about community organizing and the story about how it has been impacting people, but how the story, it seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong, and that's my question, it seems to me that the story of Catholic engagement in community organizing in the form of the Industrial Areas Foundation or Faith in Action, the old Pacific Institute, which has grown and grown and grown, over the last 40 years has provided a number of examples of how, for instance, undocumented people can gain power. You know, it's been a struggle, but it's been real.
Yeah.
My question just is this, to what extent are we integrating the lessons of that experience? I don't know of too many writers who have dedicated themselves. I know there's Richard Woods at the University of New Mexico has done study on organizing and the church's involvement in it. But it's really been, as you know, through the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, a lot of organizing institutions wouldn't exist without the help of that. But anyway, there's just a question and how pertinent it would be to where we are right now and where we can go.
Yeah. So one of my 3 examples, Kim Redigan, is a community organizer, although she doesn't do that as a full-time profession, so that might be an example of what you're talking about. But I know that on the program, there's at least 3 papers on community organizing. So those people are the experts. Are any of you here? Would you like to speak to that? They're not. They are. Yes.
Shout out for tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. There's a wonderful play
Yeah.
on the founder of Catholic Charities, who was a collaborator with Sowle.
Yeah.
Okay, and how it developed community organizing around the time of the Great Depression. So you're up at 8 o'clock in here. You might be interested in that connection with the IAF and Catholic work.
Does anyone else have any thing that they'd like to share on that topic? I mean, this is not my specific area of expertise, so I'd be happy to defer. Okay, well, I see other people ready to talk.
So, Lisa, I really appreciated that presentation. Bill, and I hope you would make it available to us on the website. Brother Ray Fitz from the University of Dayton. The interesting thing about your Flint case is we had something that showed the violence that was being done to the young people in that community. But if we look at every one of our urban areas with high poverty neighborhoods, which have maybe 3 times, 4 times, 5 times as many black children, African American children, 4 times as many Hispanic children, the silent violence of poverty is impacting their brain day in and day out. And it's really making a difference in their ability to perform in school. And then the whole environment gets these young people through school where they're not ready to go to higher education. So I think what I'm looking for is how do we make known this kind of violence that's much more silent than what the Flint case was?
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure I think you're pointing something out. I don't know that there's a simple answer to that. I do think you're right, though. In the Flint case, there was clear evidence of what was going on. I think what the Flint case shows is just the depth of denial and racism that all these bureaucrats were caught up in. You know, that's the cultural part of it. Because despite that evidence, change was slow to happen.
Hi, I'm John Noble from Bright Divinity School. I was really curious in your framework about this idea of personal transformation in a group preceding structural community change. Mm-hmm. Do you see like differences in that personal transformation for people on different ends of a power differential? So I'm thinking of like the bureaucrats who poisoned the water versus the black communities who had their water poisoned, right?
Yeah. I think there are differences, but I guess that I would say the personal transformation and the structural transformation are interdependent, because I don't see individual agency as simply subjective and sort of enclosed. So I think what we're able to recognize and see, and also what our affections and emotions are very much tied into the relationships that we're in and also the practices that we go through day by day. So, you know, coming to this conference, hearing everybody talk about all this, listening to the first questioner who spoke from the standpoint of an undocumented person and then gave lots of examples. So then those examples are part of our practice of being here. But it's not just understanding, it's also emotions, it's affections, it's relationships. So that has to do with the structures that we're in and the practices that we engage, as well as the way we think in sort of our subjective dimension. And I think that's a big part of Pope Francis's message. In Laudato Si, I think he mentioned something like 17 or 18 different local bishops' conferences. So he was clearly hoping to mobilize at the grassroots. Maybe the Philippines is the one national church that really has taken that the furthest on ecology. Of course, they're also in an endangered environment. So there's a lot that has to go on simultaneously. That's why, like in the Flint case, there were all the demonstrations, there was the media involvement, the churches got involved, so they started to link this cause to their faith and their religious identity, especially the Black Protestant churches in Flint. So all of this went on. People were being engaged at a lot of different levels simultaneously. So we have to get outside our comfort zone, and then our vision can change too.
Hi, Lisa.
Hi,
Marcus
Mark.
Mesher. How are you?
Good.
So
far.
Pope Francis talks a lot about ecological conversion in Laudato Si. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what that would take in an American context. And I have 3 ideas in mind for you to speak to. The first is widespread doubt among most Americans that climate change is even real or that it's human caused. And I mean, you have this coming from the White House where, you know, data is being deleted from White House websites to kind of throw a lot of suspicion on whether or not this is real and urgent. The second thing is a question of the moral nature of climate change. I think Yael had a study after Laudato Si came out and Pope Francis had his visit to the United States, and still more than 50% of Americans didn't see climate change as a moral problem. So interested in your thoughts about that. And then the third is the moral credibility of the Catholic Church in the wake of the sex abuse scandal. So if the Church and the Catholic Covenant for Climate Change, if they're going to be a leading edge on trying to be prophetic and trying to organize, to what extent has that credibility been lost, and what would it take to regain it?
That last one is huge. I really can't answer that. So just on your first point, that there's still a lot of climate change denial, I think that's true, there is. But I did read a study that was circulated by the Yael Project for Climate Communication just recently. I think it was done either the end of last year or maybe in January. But it showed that over half of Americans, like up to, depending on specifically what they were asking, up to like 3/4 of Americans do believe that climate change is a problem, and that they or their family are going to be affected by it, within a certain number of years, or have already been. I think that especially the next question that you asked, can't remember exactly how you put it, but I was thinking about, that it's a moral issue. Okay, I think that that's a bigger problem. seeing it as a moral issue is part of defining its urgency and giving it priority. And I think that's where the slippage is. People recognize it, but when they're voting or when they're making decisions about other things in their lives, climate change just slips down the list. So that's a good example of how we can recognize that something's true, but we're still not motivated to do anything about it. And it's more than just like sloth and bad will. We're involved in other sorts of practices, institutions, and structures that divert our attention in a different way, sometimes a very worthwhile way. But it's how do we get this really up? Erin Lowe's-Biviano has a book called Inspired Sustainability, and she talks in that book, she wrote the book, I think, well, I don't know. I'm not sure how much she builds this off Pope Francis, but she is talking about the problem of political will. And you know, she tries to look at ways to get people more motivated. So participating in a community that's, you know, enhancing and affirming these goals is helpful, and you know, other things. But I guess I'm identifying mostly that problem. It's not as much the denial, and it's not even the credibility of the bishops. It's that most people just aren't interested enough. And so can the Catholic Church or organizations do more? Not just the bishops. It can't just all be kicked upstairs to the bishops. But what can Catholic organizations also do, and Catholic groups?
Ellen, we'll ask our last question, and then we'll move to the dessert procession to the right. Ellen?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Lisa, for your very interesting reflections. But I was wondering, coming from a European context, to what extent the use of violence by the grassroots communities might have changed the rhetoric of your analysis, but also of the response. And the question, the reason I ask it is because, as I will talk about in my paper, I'm focusing on the Gilets jaunes in France, so the yellow vest movement, who are now increasingly using violence and creating riots, etc., in the streets of Paris. And the damage is running into $200 million at this point. And so now Macron has decided, the president has decided to involve the army the next time they're going to go on the streets. And so, of course, because of this use of violence, they're losing a lot of credibility and support, whereas they had a lot of support before. So the risk is that because of the use of violence, it becomes an excuse to not have to deal with it anymore. The establishment can easily say, like, we don't care about it. And I notice it with myself and friends talking about it, like, yeah, I want to support the Gilets jaunes, the movements, but not them, etc. So you get this separation. On the other hand, as someone else pointed out, the poverty that they are involved in and have to deal with it day by day is the silent violence, the invisible violence that they now fight against, but in a visible way. But of course, this invisible violence is much more easier to deny and ignore. So, yeah, I was just wondering what you think about it.
I mean, I'm not going to speak to the French situation and what's going on there because I'm not well informed enough, but I think you've identified an important problem or issue. So one of the things I was arguing in my paper is that the work of CST cannot get done simply on the basis of moral appeals and persuasion, because structural sin is strong. So in Flint, there was a lot of pressure, public pressure, media pressure, et cetera, exerted against the bureaucracy that was ignoring the situation that was right in front of them. And the challenge is, or the challenge, the dilemma, I guess, is how to measure and utilize coercive force in a productive way. So to just speak of armed force, such as you're talking about, we could look at, revolutions, such as we see in France, but also War and Peace, we talk about humanitarian intervention. Then it's debatable whether that works. Just to bring it back to the environment, or the examples that I gave in the United States context, it is a challenge and a discernment process, I think, a matter of prudence. How much pressure will be productive given the audience or the constituency that has to be turned around, and how much would produce a backlash such that the goals would then be even harder to meet? I think that that's a question that's got to be addressed in every particular situation, and I'm sure there are no real formulas. In our country here, there's been a debate for a generation now over the tactics of Martin Luther King, which were nonviolent, versus Malcolm X, which were much more confrontational, similar eras. So what's more effective, what's really justified, what's morally justified, but what's also politically justified in terms of consequences? I think you've put your finger on something that's important to think about. Thank you.